Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's great to be back.
So I want you to picture something. It's the middle of the 1850s. You're high up in the Scottish Highlands, maybe on the peak of Ben Macdui. The wind is just biting, it's freezing, and you see this figure in the distance. He's in the somber black clothes of a theologian, and he's smashing rocks with a hammer.
Right, and this isn't some gentleman's hobby.
No, not at all. This man, John Anderson, he's basically fighting a war. He's looking at the granite right there under his feet, and he's trying to prove something extraordinary. He's trying to prove that geology, the science everyone feared was, killing religion, is actually the one thing that makes atheism completely impossible.
And that's really the core of the book we're diving into today, The Course of Creation. Anderson's whole argument is that if you just look closely enough at the Earth, at the dirt, the coal, the fossils, you don't find some cosmic accident.
No.
You find a blueprint. You find a house that was very carefully built, renovated over ages, and then stocked with supplies for a very specific tenant who was yet to arrive.
It's such a fascinating reversal, isn't it? Because we tend to think of Victorian science as the thing that pushed God out of the picture. But Anderson is using that very same science to try and find him.
To prove his existence logically.
Exactly. Now, before we grab our own geological hammers, I just have one quick thing to ask. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these deep dives for you.
Okay, so let's get back to that mountain. Anderson is standing there looking out over what he calls the stony regions. And he's not seeing a wasteland. He's completely in awe. He calls the mountains altars.
Altars. But he's not just there for the view. He's there to take on a really, really popular philosophical argument of his time. An argument that involves a watch and a stone.
Ah, yes. The famous Paley argument. William Paley's watchmaker analogy.
Right. Can you lay that out for us?
Sure. So Paley's idea was simple. If you're walking in a field and you find a watch, you pick it up, you see all the tiny gears and springs, you know instantly it had a maker.
Of course. It's complex. It has a purpose.
Exactly. But Paley said if you just kick a stone on that same path, you just assume it's the object.
Huh.
Well, it's just a stone. It could have been there forever. It's just unshapen, mindless matter.
The definition of a dumb object.
And that's where Anderson, standing on that mountain, picks up a piece of granite and says, basically, absolute nonsense. He argues that that stone is every bit as manufactured as the watch.
I mean, okay, that feels like a stretch. A rock doesn't tell time. It doesn't have gears. How does he even begin to justify that?
He goes straight to the chemistry, to the microscopic level. He points out that granite isn't just a random gray blob. It's a very specific compound of three things: mica, quartz, and feldspar.
Okay.
And they aren't just, mashed together like dough. He talks about how they were once separated elements, then fused in a burning crucible deep in the earth, and then cooled into exact geometrical crystalline forms. He calls it the law of structure.
So their argument is that because the crystals always form in a predictable way, they must be following a rule book.
Precisely. He asks, what chemistry elaborated these particles? What scales weighed their elements? For Anderson, there is no such thing as unshapen matter. Even the rawest piece of rock is obeying these incredibly strict laws of atomic structure.
And the theological point is, if there's a law, there has to be a lawgiver.
That's the leap. You can't get that kind of consistent order from pure chaos without an organizing mind behind it all.
It really does change how you look at the ground beneath your feet. It's not just dirt, it's architecture.
It's architecture, and it's also machinery. And this leads him to his next point about the Earth's crust and what they call central heat.
Right, the idea that the Earth is a molten ball with a thin crust.
Yeah, and the common scientific theory back then was that the Earth was just a cooling spin top. Mountains and valleys were just, wrinkles that formed as the planet cooled and shrank. A happy accident to physics, really.
The fortuitous concourse of atoms, as the old saying goes.
Anderson rejects the accident part completely. He accepts that the Earth is hot inside. He even mentions it's hot enough to melt iron just 24 miles down. But he argues that the way the crust is broken, the way the mountains are forced upwards, is a deliberate, purposeful act. He calls volcanoes and granites the levers of the Almighty.
Levers. That implies a hand is pulling them.
That is his entire argument. He says God used these massive violent forces to lift the continents out of the primeval ocean, to crack the crust and form river valleys, to basically landscape the entire planet to make it habitable.
So an earthquake isn't a random disaster in his view.
No, it's a necessary renovation. It's all part of getting the house ready for life.
I love that idea of planetary renovation. And speaking of getting the house ready, that takes us to his next big argument, which I think is just incredible, the coal.
Ah, yes. This is where he really leans into the idea of perspective design.
So God looking millions of years into the future.
Exactly. So picture the Carboniferous era. We're talking about vast, steaming swamps, giant tree ferns, ancient forests covering the land.
Okay.
Anderson looks at these huge, thick seams of coal buried deep underground, and he asks a very practical question. Why? What was the point of all those plants? They weren't fruit trees. They weren't, wheat or barley. They were basically giant, fibrous, inedible weeds, useless to any animal alive at the time.
So they had no purpose in their own time.
Not in an immediate biological sense. But Anderson argues that God foresaw that man, specifically civilized industrial man, would one day arrive on the scene. And he knew we would need a powerful, concentrated energy source to build our world.
So it's like hiding a massive generator in the basement of a house centuries before the tenants are even born.
That is the perfect analogy. He explicitly calls the coal fields a storehouse, prepared in advance. But here's where it gets even more detailed and, to him, more convincing. It's not just that the coal exists, it's how it's placed in the earth.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. If the coal layers were just laid down flat and then buried under millions of years of new rock, they'd be miles deep.
Yeah.
Completely inaccessible.
Useless to us. We'd never get to it.
Right. But remember those levers we talked about? The geological faults, the earthquakes, the crust shifting and buckling. Those forces broke up the coal seams. They tilted them. They pushed them up towards the surface in these convenient patches. Anderson says the very violence of the earth was a delivery system.
A delivery system to bring the fuel right to our doorstep.
And it gets even more specific than that.
Yeah.
This is what he sees as the absolute smoking gun for design. He points out that, geologically speaking, coal is almost always found in the same regions as limestone and ironstone.
Why does that specific combination matter so much?
Just think about the Industrial Revolution. What three things do you absolutely need to smelt iron and make steel? You need the ore, which is ironstone. You need the fuel to get the furnace hot enough, which is coal.
And you need a flux, something to help melt out the impurities.
Which is limestone.
And you're saying they're all sitting there together in the same parts of the world?
That is Anderson's whole point. He argues that finding fuel, ore, and flux all packed together like that is just too perfect to be an accident. He calls it a prearranged industrial kit. The raw materials for the steam engine, for the railroad, for civilization itself were stacked together, just waiting.
That is a wild thought. He's literally saying the industrial age was written into the rocks of the Carboniferous period.
It's geology as prophecy.
Cool.
He says nature constructed these plants specifically to be bitumenized and stored away for a future moral era.
Wow. So if the coal is a record of the future, he also talks about records of the distant past, the footprints.
Yes, the fossil footprints in the sandstone. He focuses on one in particular, the Chirotherium. It means the hand beast.
That sounds like something from a nightmare.
Its footprint looked a bit like a human hand, which is where it got the name. But Anderson uses these ancient tracks for this really dramatic, almost dark metaphor about morality and justice.
How does he connect a fossil to morality?
He compares finding that footprint to a detective finding a clue. He says, imagine a murderer fleeing a crime scene in the dead of night. He thinks he's totally alone, unseen. But he steps in a patch of mud.
Okay.
And that mud, over centuries, hardens into rock. The footprint remains. It's a permanent record. It proves he was there. It can track him to his den.
The rock is a witness.
The rock is an infallible witness. He calls this the great universal law. Just as the stone recorded the passing of some ancient reptile that no human eye ever saw, it proves that no act is ever truly lost or forgotten. The earth itself is a recording book.
That's a heavy thought. If the ground can remember a lizard walking on a beach millions of years ago, then our actions are definitely not going unrecorded.
Precisely. For Anderson, this directly implies a recording angel. It proves we live in a moral universe where every action leaves an indelible trace. He's building this bridge from physical geology directly to theology. To him, they're part of the same system.
He's building a really solid fortress for his argument. But he's not just building his own case, is he? He's actively fighting against a rival theory that was gaining a lot of traction. The development theory.
Right, context is everything here. It's 1851. Darwin's Origin of Species is still 8 years in the future. But the general idea of evolution, or transmutation as they called it, was already in the air. A book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation was a huge anonymous bestseller, and it was making religious thinkers very nervous.
And what was the core argument of Vestiges?
Basically, that life evolved from simple to complex through natural laws without God having to, step in at every stage. It argued you could start with a nucleated vesicle, a simple cell, and that electricity acting on mucus or something could kickstart life, and then over millions of years you get a human.
And Anderson, with his granite and his coal, just wasn't having any of it.
He absolutely despised it. He attacks the very foundation of the idea, which is chance. And to do that, he reaches all the way back to the Roman philosopher Cicero and the gold letters argument.
Oh, I like this one. What is it?
It's a great thought experiment. Imagine you have a complete alphabet, say 26 letters, all made of solid gold. You take them and you just throw them onto the ground. What are the odds that they will randomly land in the exact formation of a beautiful, coherent poem?
0. I mean, not a chance. You just get a jumble of gold letters.
Right. And Anderson says atoms are no different. You can't just throw a bunch of atoms together and accidentally get a functioning world, or an animal, or an eye.
And he gets really specific with the eye, doesn't he? He brings some serious numbers to the table with the codfish eye.
Oh, this is where he really tries to just crush the idea of chance with brute force mathematics. He talks about dissecting the eye of a common codfish. He notes that its crystalline lens alone contains 5 million fibers.
5 million.
And then he says those 5 million fibers are held together by 62 billion tiny interlocking teeth or processes.
Wait, hold on. 62 billion? In a single fish's eye?
In one eye of one common fish. And Anderson just lays that number down and asks, how could chance, or a blind struggle for existence, produce a mechanism with 62 billion perfectly interlocking parts? For him, the math for atheism just doesn't work. It's an absurdity. It points to a designer who loves precision.
He also uses the Egyptian mummies to argue that species don't change, right?
Yes, that was a very common line of argument at the time. Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt had brought back all these perfectly preserved, mummified animals, cats, ibises, crocodiles, and they were 3,000 years old.
And they looked exactly the same as modern animals.
Identical.
Yeah.
The mummified cat is no different from the cat sleeping on your sofa.
Yeah.
So Anderson's point is, see, 3,000 years and 0 change. He says nature is stubborn. A cat is a cat. A species is fixed. If this development theory were true, we should see things in transition, but we don't.
Which all leads to his final, most important point about humanity. Because if we aren't just, highly evolved fish or apes, then what are we?
This is the absolute hill he will die on theologically. He completely refuses to accept that man is just another animal on a continuum. He gives man this grand title, the priest of nature.
The priest of nature. What exactly does he mean by that?
He means that of all the creatures on Earth, man is the only one capable of understanding creation and giving voice to it. A rock can't praise God. A dinosaur couldn't look at a sunset and feel awe. We are the consciousness of the world. We're here to offer intelligent praise on behalf of all of it.
So we're the designated observers, the reason for the show.
Yes. And Anderson argues that if you connect man to a purely material origin, if you say we are just slime that got lucky, you destroy that special status. You make morality and the soul just chemical reactions in the brain. He insists that man stands alone, separated from the animal kingdom by a divine, unbridgeable gulf.
Okay, so we have this incredibly detailed picture, a designed house stocked with coal built for us, the priests of nature. But we have to talk about the timeline. The mammoth in the room, maybe?
Yes. The 6 days, the conflict that never seems to go away.
Exactly. The Bible, Genesis, says creation happened in 6 days. Geology was already talking about millions, hundreds of millions of years. Anderson is a doctor of divinity. He's also a geologist. How on earth does he square that circle?
He doesn't throw either one out. He tries to harmonize them. He advocates for what's known as the day-age theory. He says the days of Genesis are not literal 24-hour periods. They are vast geological epochs, eras.
So when the Bible says, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day, he sees that as a metaphor.
A metaphor for the beginning and end of an entire geological age. And he argues that if you read it that way, the order of events in geology perfectly matches the order of events in Genesis.
Really? How so?
Well, he lays it out. What comes first in the geological record? Massive plant life. That's the Carboniferous era, the coal forests. Genesis says, let the earth bring forth vegetation. Then you get the great sea monsters, the marine reptiles, then birds, then land animals, mammals, cattle. And who appears last of all in the most recent strata? Man, exactly as it is in Genesis. So he says Moses was inspired to write the physical truth of creation, even if he didn't have the scientific vocabulary for it.
But, and this is a key detail, he doesn't think God just wound up a clock and let it go, right? It's not just one long process.
No, absolutely not. This is crucial to his argument against the development theory. He believes in repeated, direct, divine intervention.
What does that look like in the rocks?
It looks like mass extinctions.
Yeah.
The fossil record clearly shows these moments where entire worlds of life are just wiped out. The end of the age of the dinosaurs, for example. Anderson says after each catastrophe, God stepped in again. He performed a new act of creation.
A reboot.
A total reboot. After the reptiles were gone, God says, let there be mammals, and creates them. It's not one species slowly changing into another. It's a series of distinct, separate creative acts. He calls it a refitting of the planet for the next age.
It really is a complete, all-encompassing worldview, isn't it? He's looking at the layers of rock, and he's not just seeing history, he's seeing a story with a plot, moving towards a specific conclusion.
And that really is his final point. The deeper you dig, he says, the more you are forced to believe. He calls the fossil record a necropolis, a city of the dead. But it's a city that speaks of life, of purpose, and of design.
Which brings us all the way back to the beginning, back to that idea of the tenant.
Yes. And this is the thought I think we should leave you all with. Anderson basically poses this challenge. If the world is filled with this breathtaking mathematical precision, 62 billion parts in a fish's eye, the geometric laws of a crystal.
And if it's filled with these prospective resources.
Right, this prepared pantry. Coal and iron and limestone laid down together millions of years before anyone was around to use them. If the world is so obviously a prepared home, does the existence of that house not necessitate the existence of an intended tenant?
And if we are that tenant, does that make the planet less of a random rock and more of a home that was built just for us?
And if it is a home, then there must be an architect.
That really does change how you look at a simple lump of coal or a cliffside. It's not just geology anymore, it's a message.
That's Anderson's challenge. Look at the design, look at the preparation, and then try to tell him it was all just an accident. He's betting everything that you can't.
Well, that is all the time we have for today on Thinking Deeper. We have hiked the Scottish Highlands, we've mined for carboniferous coal, and we've tracked the creator through the fossil record.
It has been quite a journey.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, please don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.